Big highlight from Shoe and Show this week.
Additional spending on gas, which means $670 per household per year, not spending on other stuff, including footwear. So you're talking about less discretionary purchases across a range of goods and services, including footwear. And that's that feather impact that is set to last much deeper into 2027.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting edition of the world's greatest business footwear podcast, or footwear business podcast, I guess I should say. I'm joined with two of my closest pals in the industry and personally, Andy Polk and Gary Rains. And gentlemen, we're coming in to have a conversation particularly around how the war with Iran is impacting costing conversations amongst the industry. Andy, you took it upon yourself to do a deep dive into what the impact would be, not just on the freight. Like, that's what we first think of when we're moving stuff around. Like, oh my gosh, it's going to cost me more at the pump personally or at the port professionally, but also doing a deep dive into all the different components that go into footwear. People will be blown away as we talk about all the different components. So at the outset, what is your working thesis, and what are some of the things that you uncovered in your research?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I think is really important is, and this is stuff that Gary works on every single week, is like, I think the economics, the foundational economics are really important to baseline, like where costs may go, right? But I think the challenge with our traditional economics is even when we were looking at sales and issues in COVID, like some of the modeling that we had was just kind of antiquated. And I think for this, it's one of those things where you need the economics and you need to do the math, but there's also this behavioral economics where people are not rational right now. There's a lot of fear. How they might price is, and cost goods as it goes through the supply chain might be very different than we imagine. It might be faster than we imagine. Typically, if you look at models, and Gary can talk to this, but typically if you look at the models, and cost increases at the start of your supply chain, it might take a year to like filter through. But we're in an environment where these suppliers were just hit with tariffs, a lot of tariffs, and they tried to absorb as much as they could. And I think with the oil cost and input cost increasing, I'm just not sure how much absorption there is in the market between brands and suppliers and factories. How much more can they absorb in cost to not pass along that cost to the consumer and keep demand and product selling at the right price at retail? Before we get into like where the components are and all that, I think, and Gary, I think you need to chime in as well, but I think that's a real concern is we don't know. Directionally, we know costs are going up. How fast they go up, how much they go up is really this irrational fear of supply. So like we know in Asia, there's people very concerned about supply of oil and continuity of production or movement of goods. So how do they price in that environment? But equally too, the cost of oil, spikes 30%. Our inputs are directly tied to that. But before we get into the inputs, I think Gary needs to like dive in a little bit to this behavioral economics, because I think it's really important for brands and companies to understand that, because they might feel a little whiplash right now when they're talking to suppliers and they're like, whoa, the cost is like, normally the cost, we know costs are going up, but we work together to fold that in over time. But you're telling me it's just a jump. Like, what is the negotiation? So Gary, I don't know how you feel about that before we jump into like the minutia.
Yeah, certainly. I think you're spot on with a lot of your observations. And in fact, coming back to behavioral economics, I couldn't agree more. You're looking at old school economics. Anyone who had an economics class, 30, 40 years ago remembers talking about economic man. This is this imaginary creature that does everything logically and
I thought that was you, Gary. You're economic man, right?
Different economic man.
Sounds like a superhero on HBO Max. I'd watch that show, perhaps.
I think he's in the Marvel Extended Universe.
Okay.
With the big E on the chest,
And so, like a calculator. Anyway, go ahead.
And there goes the conversation.
And there goes Andy's eye roll as we talk about comic books.
So this fabled economic man is a fictitious person who does everything logically and rationally. And that's not the way, the human psyche works. And that kind of developed this whole notion that Andy's talking about of behavioral economics, which has become much more mainstream the last 20, 30 years or so. And behavioral economics kind of throws economic man out the window because none of us really function rationally and logically all the time. A lot of times, emotion comes into it. Think of retail therapy. Sometimes we go shopping just to go shopping. Well, economic man wouldn't do that just to spend money, just to alleviate stress or whatever. So behavioral economics is absolutely a key driver that I think is behind not only a big part of the spike in prices we've seen now, but I think is likely to contribute to this downstream price pressure that Andy was talking about.
Now, Andy, I want to tap into your absorption comment because last year was an anomaly. It was a weird year. We went from a $3 billion duty bill to $6.22 billion in 1 year because of the tariffs. And at the same time, as the FOB price of goods was growing pretty dramatically, retail prices were flat. And so the sponge is fully saturated, and it's about time to wring that sucker out onto the consumer where they're going to see price increases, particularly if you're trying to drive up prices all along the supply chain. So your analysis is spot on because the importers are done with price increases. I mean, they can only absorb so much. The sponge is full.
Yeah, and I think it's a point where, people really need to look at inventory, right? Like, what can we control in this environment is the first thing that I look at. And the oil prices, the spike that went up at 30%, and it keeps fluctuating based on whatever the president puts out about the war winding down, et cetera, et cetera. The challenge is like there's a lot of refineries and oil production that's been hit by Iran to create economic angst and uncertainty and trying to hit what they can. So even if the war winds down tomorrow and we have some kind of settlement or truce or something, you've still got refineries and an oil production that will not return to the levels that we had. So I think what the first thing we need to realize is oil is probably going to be above $90 a barrel for some time. So even if the war ends and that irrational exuberance or the irrational fears kind of stabilize, the cost there's going to be a new ground for the cost of oil. So that's one thing. So these prices are going to rise quicker than we think, I think right now, and they're going to stabilize. It's not like they're going to drop back down for some time based on what's happening. But the absorption thing is a real thing because it's margin, right? When we talk about absorption, that's margin. It's like your operating profit. So they've already reduced our operating profit. Let's say it went from 10 to 5, right? Well, how much more can you absorb without layoffs, reduction in inventory? I mean, if I'm a brand, I'm looking at my materials and saying, like, how do I really need to put this into my shoe? Like, how do I start to strip out some, and you don't want to talk about it, but how do I strip out certain things in the shoe that may not be fully necessary? So quality reduces.
Yeah, to lower that FOB price, right?
So it's all those things. So I was saying the other day to someone, like, this oil crisis that we have is a lot like tariffs. It's just a different thing, but it has the same impact. It's just at a different point in the supply chain where a tariff was in the middle and reverberated up to the consumer and back to the supplier who was absorbing this. Oil starts at the very beginning of our supply chain and it rolls all the way through. And so the report that we put out, and I'm guessing our members can find this and we'll push it out. If you need a copy of it, you can just email us at info@fdra.org and we'll provide it to you. But it's about a 20-page document looking at the material inputs. And what we found was for like a basic synthetic sneaker in the market, buy at a big box store, about 70% of that shoe has some exposure to oil price. And part of that's the transit cost, yes. But about 30% of that synthetic shoe is oil. So it's something we don't like talking a lot about, right? But the reality is oil as a feedstock is about 30% of a synthetic shoe for today. So if you're thinking about 30% of the material cost increasing along with this path, the FOB is naturally going to increase.
Yeah, it gets
the debate
compounded.
that Gary and I have is like how much percent and how fast. But we already hear it, right? We hear it from our members saying like, we're hearing from suppliers that these things are really costing, and like we're already having these negotiations well ahead of what we normally would have. And so yeah, I'll pull Gary in here again as well, because the percents and the time frame. I do think because of the tariffs, it's a double, triple, quadruple, whatever you want to call it, whammy, because the tariff impact is still lingering. Because those suppliers also know, even the Supreme Court ruling against the IEEPA tariffs, there's going to be more tariffs coming.
Yeah.
So they got to hold cash too. There's a cash flow problem with the tariffs. You add in this oil issue, and it's like, what if I'm a supplier? I'm like, what do you want me to do?
Insult to injury.
Yeah, so Gary, I don't know, in terms of speed traditionally versus today with what's happening with absorption and oil and, the irrational fears of shortages even.
I look at it like there are three issues that are key here in kind of modeling out any downstream impact. Which direction? I think that's pretty obvious. Which way did the hit come from? How soon and how much? And once you can model those three out, you can get a pretty good estimate for the downstream impact. As you said, footwear is unlike a lot of other industries. It is oil impacts footwear on both the production side and the distribution, the consumer side. Not many industries are touched in all the ways that the oil touches footwear in the same way. So yeah, of course, we've already seen the impact at the prices at the pump, and that was within just a day or two. You began to see the spike in oil prices in late February, and it hit almost immediately within just a day or two. We're beginning to see some of that cost pressure pushed on now in the form of fuel surcharges, and it's been just 3-4 weeks since that's happened. And I think you're going to see that with starting at the 2-month mark. It's going to begin to reflect itself in the resin costs. And I think a little further on, you're going to see it really permeate the rest of the supply chain. On all told, it could be upwards of a year before it fully permeates the supply chain. But I can see a lot of the impacts showing up in FOB prices as early as the summer. But I think the full impact will be closer to a year. And again, a lot of that depends, like Andy said, a lot of it depends on how soon prices retreat closer to normal. And I don't think that's going to be anytime soon at all. As Andy said, with the damage that's been done to production capacity and refineries in the Middle East, there are estimates that it may be 3 to 5 years before those refineries are repaired and get back to running capacity anywhere close to where they were in late February. So it could be an issue that impacts the footwear space much longer than just that 12-month mark. If oil stays relatively high for the longer term, then you're looking at that downstream lagged impact being relatively high for the longer term.
Yeah, I think, I mean, to that point, Matt, like it is a thing where if we did have some truce or some end of conflict where there were missiles striking anything, right, and there's calmness, you would see oil decrease. Right? You would see it maybe drop some percent, but then the reality kicks in of what the actual supply is.
Yeah.
So like supply and demand those are facts. Those aren't like irrational. And it's just like at some point it can't go below this because the market has a certain demand and there's a certain supply, and that will determine the price. I mean, that's economics 101. But I think for folks out there, what Gary was talking about, if we look back starting at tier 4, which is kind of, you could even say tier 5, but I'd say tier 4 is like raw material extraction. So farming or mining, in this case, it's oil extraction from the ground that goes into petrochemicals. And for petrochemicals for footwear, we identified in our report about 25. There's more than that, but there's foams, so there's EVAs, PUs, there's TPUs, there's plastic structural components to it, nylons, synthetic textiles, spandex. It also goes into rubber compounds, so synthetic rubber outsoles. It's you use oil as a feedstock for adhesives and bondings, for small components, reinforcements, films. So I mean, it's pretty. If there's 60 materials in the average shoe, like half of those probably are, half of those materials probably have feedstock from oil in some way. And that's where you start to get this question of, if oil is that high and petrochemical that's the direct feedstock for all these materials that we use, there's no way that the petrochemical folks are absorbing that. They're going to pass it along. So then the question then becomes in the tier 3, tier 2. Tier 3 are the kind of petrochemical companies, so they're going to pass it to tier 2. Tier 2 is the components and material folks who take that refined petrochemicals and develop it into the foams and components and things like that the tier 1 needs. So that's at the point where you can start to have some negotiation where they're like, all right, like if demand's going to soften from consumers because prices are higher, we're going to have less to make. How do we adjust that? And then how do we cost that to our tier 1 partners? What can they absorb? What can we absorb? So I think a lot of brands and companies out there are thinking about like just negotiating with tier 1 and negotiating with their freight contracts and all that. But like, this is where, if you have sourcing agents in Asia, this is where your caution comes in. And I've been saying this for a long time, and I know why they're sourcing agents and I understand the models, but they're in a high cost environment like this. You actually need to know who your material suppliers are to help better negotiate rates and kind of have a better line of sight into cost. That's both on the compliance side with like forced labor issues, but it also is on your costs at this point. Like you should have some line of sight and control over tier 2. You can't just cede it all to tier 1. So if you've got sourcing agents, I understand it. But if they're not giving you what you need to look at the costing from the materials and they're hiding that, that's a real problem for your business long term. But those negotiations are going on tier 2, tier 1. How much can you absorb? How much can I absorb? Again, it's very much like the tariff situation.
Right.
It's just amplified because there literally is no more give.
Yeah.
And so, once petrochemicals costs go up and start flowing into the tier 2 component suppliers, like, that it becomes a thing where I think we were estimating, by early summer, you could see FOB going up. And it depends on product type and
sure
contracts and your volume and all that, of course. But like, could be by like late summer, you start seeing FOB go from $20 to $20.30. So 30 cents per pair. And you hear that and it's not like, well, okay, but that's also the duty rate then hits higher.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. I mean, I put this intel on last week's What I'm Hearing, but I've gotten a number of reports, particularly out of Asia, from people who are working through this process right now with all their suppliers. One person in particular said factories are talking about price increases, but have not really started to implement the full impact of the oil increases. Raw material suppliers are running through backstock. When that runs through the supply chain, the full impact of oil prices will hit. Factories are shy about giving out long-term prices. This person expects about 10 to 15% increases with current environment in conjunction with negotiation. This does not include the impact of transportation, which could be just as big, if not bigger of an impact. We are keeping a close watch and not delaying on opportunities. I had someone else tell me they're already seeing $375 in fuel surcharges per container. If you look at something like air freight, you want to get product in, something selling hot, you got to get it to market, speed to market. That's up. Someone quoted 75% on jet fuel is up month over month. And that just will instantly impact the ability to air freight's already expensive, but that will make it even more expensive. And to both of your points, just not just on the movement of goods, but if you just peruse just the headlines and some of our top suppliers over the last week or two, Vietnam, fuel prices have risen sharply. Gasoline's up 50%, diesel's up 70%, prompting emergency policy responses such as accelerating ethanol fuel adoption. Cambodia, reports indicate fuel shortages and temporary petrol station closures, with the country increasingly relying on rerouted imports from Singapore and Malaysia. India imports more than 80% of its energy, and recent developments include currency depreciation and fuel constraints. Bangladesh is seeking external finance to secure fuel imports and is facing energy constraints. I can go on and on. I have a whole report here that we pulled together. We can also send that out to you if you're interested. But to the broader point, this touches everything. Just when you think you can tamp down on one aspect of it through some clever negotiation on the input side with a tier 1 supplier, the whole country just running out of energy. And so there's just like nowhere to run anymore, man. We had a call just a few weeks ago, our sourcing supply check-in, essentially our sourcing strategy check-in that we do in the spring. And like between 2020 and 2026, we have seen everything. And people were worn out, but Gary, it's one of those things where economics man, all his logic in the world is like, oh my gosh, I can't even deal with the PTSD that comes with each and every day of working on the footwear supply chain.
Yeah, you're talking about the price. I see it's not just a price issue. And Matt, I think you hit the nail on the head that it's a supply issue, and not just for oil. Oil by extension impacts natural gas and indirectly coal. That is that hamburger hot dog effect that, when the price of hamburger goes up, the demand for hot dogs goes up. We're seeing that same thing here. As the price of oil goes up, the demand for coal is going up, and by extension, the price of coal goes up. And of course, a lot of those Asian factories are powered off natural gas or coal. And that, I've exactly to your point that it's not just a price issue, but it's also a supply issue of getting those energy feedstock materials into these Asian factories. And I see a lot of potential that we may see increased shortages, factory shortages in factories across Asia. And I think that could only be the tip of the iceberg. Even with oil well over $100 for most of the last month now, we really haven't seen a lot of factory closures just yet. That could be the next proverbial shoe to drop.
Definitely rationing, right? Definitely rationing of energy, where they're shutting down production at certain hours of the day to save on energy. You could definitely see that happening sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. And that's something that I think is set to impact all of us, with so much footwear sourcing coming out of Asia. And of course, Asia is so dependent on the Middle East for oil. It's that knock-on effect that it could certainly impact footwear more than a lot of other industries.
Yeah, in our report as well, we talked about the factory level and dove into that. And there's some research that we did through the Footwear Innovation Foundation it was looking at modern manufacturing, energy inputs and emissions. So we actually have some really interesting data where the average factory in Asia, about 87% of it is electricity. But to Gary's point, the feedstock may well be oil or coal at a plant that produces the electricity, and it flows to the factory. So electricity rates are going to go up. About 10% of a factory's energy source is direct oil or natural gas. So if you think of like forklifts running off propane, you're thinking of small trucks in the factory moving materials, et cetera. So like 10% is directly impacted by the cost. But to the supply issue, it's both a worker issue and it's a factory issue, meaning like if there's rationing, can a worker get across town to the factory efficiently or at all? So you've got a worker labor issue tied to rationing or shortages for certain components. And so it does become a part where brands and companies need to have a conversation with tier 1 and tier 2, because tier 2 is going to have a problem too, and maybe you don't get your materials in on time. The tier 1 could run just fine. Maybe they don't have a ration issue, but your tier 2 could have a ration issue, and you're not getting the materials that impact production. Again, this is where you go down. You need to know who your tier 2 is.
Right.
But yeah, it's a real thing where you start to look at your scenario planning and saying like, is the supply chain from tier 2 to tier 1, like, are we okay? Do we have a game plan if there is rationing or shortages or labor issues? Tier 1, like, what's your strategy in case something like this happens? How agile are you? Do you have plans in place, et cetera? But then it gets to the point where you can control all that or seemingly, and then there's no oil or gas or diesel for the truck to get to the factory and take it to the port.
Yeah.
So it's like all these things just start to elevate. And we do cover some of that in the report. But I think, at this point where people are kind of freaking out, I think the winners are going to be the ones who know their supply chain well, have good relationships, as always, negotiate in good faith, but have a plan, more agility, and more expectation. And, one thing we didn't do, Matt, Gary and I both agreed on this. It's like we couldn't even quantify what retail might look like on the knock-on effects.
Yeah.
There's just so many variables to how a retailer may absorb a cost, push a cost along in a different category. And then, by the time we produce this, even, the transit costs that we had put in here these are hypotheticals of helping people just understand. But, diesel is at its highest rate ever in California, where we import most of our shoes, and that may still go higher. So it's really hard to know, how to break it out. And then it becomes the other question too, is are you optimized? Are you getting as much shoes on that cargo container as possible? Right. Because every pair now starts to have a little bit of a cost.
Yeah. Jam it in, man.
Right. So is your packaging optimized? Are you packaging it in the right way? Are you getting the most out of your shipments and costs in that way too? But it just goes, what can we control? Let's try to control what we can. Let's be agile with other things. But the costs are coming, and I think the message is directionally, costs are coming faster than we might imagine as an industry.
Yeah, don't get caught flat-footed. Gary, I'll give you the last word as we close out the conversation. This is going to be an ongoing conversation. So unfortunately, sometimes we have these buzzkill episodes, but we want to make sure people are aware. This report's really important. You can see it. You can find it in the description, the chat, in the episode notes below. But Gary, last word as we stare down this oil crisis and continuation.
Yeah, in economics, a lot of times there's references made to arrows and feathers that typically when prices go up, you see that downstream impact like an arrow. It goes up very fast. But then when the upstream price comes down, the downstream price kind of comes down a bit more like a feather. So it's very quick up and then very slow to come down. That's the case, not to mention, as Andy was talking about, the impacts on manufacturing production and refining capacity. That lagged impact, I could see that definite feather tendency that is set to take much longer to play out. One last parting shot. This is all great, but this is talking supply side impact on price. Talking demand side, we had touched on that on this latest Tuesday member call at 2 p.m. Eastern time, to where we only looked at oil's impact on gas prices and only in the U.S. and the impact on gas prices on the typical American household, depending on how much and how long oil and gas prices stay high. At least where we are right now, if prices persist, it's going to be about $670 a year additional spending on gas, which means $670 per household per year, not spending on other stuff, including footwear. So you're talking about less discretionary purchases across a range of goods and services, including footwear. And that's something that I think is set to have more of that feather impact that is set to last, I think, much deeper into 2027.
That's going to leave a mark for sure.
There used to be every now and again a black swan would fly into the lake, right? And unfortunately, we've got 8 black swans now swimming around the lake.
Yeah, not a good sign.
No.
Shoo, black swans, shoo away. All right, folks, this has been another edition of the Shoe and Show podcast. Speaking of shoes, we are obviously going to have this conversation ongoing. We're going to be continuing to break down the analysis that you heard here. We'll do it on the member call. We'll do it on another podcast. If you want a copy of the report, you can also email us at info@fdra.org. If you're not a member and you're missing out on all this analysis, what are you thinking? So hit us up for membership information as well. We'd love to share more about the immense value we're providing our members every single day. Until next time, Shoe and Show is out.
Shoe In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.